So today we're looking at the book of Exodus, and we're going to be looking at chapter 1 through to chapter 4 and verse 18. So if you haven't read that already, well, don't worry too much, because I'm going to cover the brief outline of the story as we go through. But you might want to go back afterwards and reread the detail that is in there. It's really fascinating. Anyway, the book begins where Genesis left off. So the clans of Israel have followed Joseph down to Egypt in order to survive the devastation of a 7-year famine. And they've settled. They have made homes in that land, and carried on growing and raising families. Now, whilst Joseph was alive, all was fantastic. But sometime after Joseph, there came a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, and who took a very different stance with this now rather numerous people. He first forced them into slave labour, and then he made that slave labour increasingly hard on them. Pharaoh then issued various edicts to the Hebrew midwives in order to prevent the Israelites from having babies, and in particular male babies, finally saying that the midwives must throw all of the male babies into the river Nile, though the girls would be allowed to live. Now hold that horrible thought for a short while. We shall see that the River Nile plays quite a significant part in this opening of the story. Now, as we move into chapter 2, we find there's a Levite mother, so one from the tribe of Levi, who had a male baby, whom she then hid for 3 months as he's growing and developing. But when he grew, and she couldn't hide him any longer, she put him in a basket and placed it in the reed beds by the river Nile. And she then placed his sister, Miriam, at a safe distance to look out for him, to look after him, to keep an eye on him. And of course, this is where Pharaoh's very daughter came to bathe. And of course, she spotted the baby, who was probably crying, and she spotted the basket, and she took pity on him. Up ran Miriam, the sister, to ask if she could find a nurse for him. Clever girl that she was, she ran to get her own mum, Moses' own mum. I mean, that's incredible, to come and nurse the child, her very own baby. Pharaoh's daughter then asked Moses' own mum to nurse him and get paid to do it. Can you imagine that? Now, as the boy grew older, she took him, so this is Moses' mum, took him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who took him then on as her own son. Before we continue the story, and boy, does it get good. There's murder, there's some slander, there's some scheming, there's a bit of chasing, and there's an escape. And the burning bush. Did I mention the burning bush? Wait a minute. I'm slightly getting ahead of myself. Let's take a step back and unpack the story so far, because there's an awful lot more going on under the waters, so to speak. You see, God never planned for his people to stay in Egypt. It was a temporary measure only. They had a land of their own. It was already bought and paid for. It was their land of promise, and they had to get back there. Also, God's people were meant to be free, not to be slaves. And killing babies? Seriously, Pharaoh, that is beneath you. It's beneath you as king. And frankly, it's beneath anyone. So God stepped up to the plate and set the stage for a 1 in a million child, a survivor, one who would be the leader that the Israelites needed, or at least in time will need. But he'll need to mature a little bit first. Within this little piece of story, though, we can see some incredible scenes. God has turned human Pharaoh's plans entirely on their head. Just get a grasp of this. First off, Pharaoh wants to use the River Nile as a place to kill Jewish babies. Instead, where do we find Moses? We find him alive in the river. Wow. Secondly, Pharaoh's edict allowed daughters to live. But hold on a moment. This part of the story is all about the daughters doing God's work, wittingly or unwittingly. Thirdly, Pharaoh's own family undermine his edict. His own daughter, by this act, ultimately brings an end to this Pharaoh's dynasty. Fourthly, Moses' very own mum, gets paid to do what she wanted to do anyway, naturally. And she gets paid out of Pharaoh's own budget. Fifthly, the princess gives the baby the name Moses. That's not an Egyptian name. Sixthly, the boy gets a royal education. He gets the best available, the best food, the best clothes, the best schooling, the best training, the best horses, the best chariots, you name it, he gets the best. Why? Because he is being treated as a prince. No slavery for Moses, this Israelite child. But I want you to take big note here, because God works his divine power out through means no one would suspect. He uses the weak to shame the strong, those with no obvious power to bring about powerful seismic change. And might I just say at this point, this is the power of the acorn rather than the power of the earthquake. And both are capable of splitting rocks. Being in a difficult place, my friends, does not mean that God has deserted you. Far from it. But when he moves to change things around, you may well find that your solution comes from a seed rather than a hurricane. After all, Jesus says, if you have faith the size of a seed, a mustard seed, you can move mountains. Wow. Now, fast forward a few years and we find the young man Moses, who identifies with the Hebrews over the Egyptians, and who then comes to the aid of one of his own who's being beaten up by an Egyptian. And he steps in and whammo, kills the Egyptian. But rather than being welcomed with open arms by his own community, Moses is pushed away by his own people. Not only that, when Pharaoh gets to hear about it, he then tries to kill Moses as well. So Moses, who's not a very popular chap right now, flees to Midian. Now that's a place some 400 kilometers to the east of Egypt, and in a place we would think of these days as Saudi Arabia. So he's fled across to Midian. And there, as soon as he arrives in that place, he discovers some shepherd girls And he rescues them because they're having trouble at the watering hole with some other shepherds. They can't get to it to water their sheep. He steps in, he helps them, and fantastic. But they then head home without Moses. And by the way, they think he is an Egyptian. Arriving home early because they've successfully managed to water the sheep, their dad asks why, and they tell him the story. And Jethro, the dad, says, "Why did you leave him there? Go and get him, ladies. Let's eat together. Let's find out more about this man. He's this dashing Egyptian." So as a result, and I'm cutting a very long story very short, just a little bit like Exodus does, Moses gets a wife, Zipporah. Fantastic. I mean, who knew, right? Escape from Pharaoh, get a wife. That's how things go. But as is the way of things, a few months later, 9 months or so later, maybe a year, they have a son who gets called Gershom. And Gershom means, I have become a stranger in a strange land. If you feel dispossessed, like a foreigner, even amongst your own, God can and will work a miracle so that you can. He's going to do it, okay? But you, in the meantime, you go and water the sheep. You go and make friends. You go and be nice to people and see what happens. Our story then takes a turn, a bit of a radical turn here, because Pharaoh dies. And there's a new Pharaoh. Only he's no better than the one before. And the Israelites are now crying out to God because of their slavery. And chapter 2, key verse, end of chapter 2, ends with this phrase, and God remembered his covenant. Thank you, Lord. So Moses, away from Egypt, has become a shepherd. And as he is tending the sheep one day, he sees a burning bush. In the hot deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, spontaneous combustion of dry bushes is probably not unheard of. What is unusual, and the reason Moses stops to see, is that this bush is in flames, but it is not being consumed. He steps closer, and God calls out to him, "Stop! Take off your sandals. This is holy ground." Now, much could be said and has been said about this, but maybe can we think about it this way? When you touch someone with gloves on, it feels impersonal. It feels almost like you haven't touched them at all. And I think this is God saying, Moses, take your sandals off, because this is personal. This is personal. This is me and you. And we need to commune and communicate. And you can't do that with your shoes on. We need a physical touch. God then unveils this plan and reminds him of the promised land and that they should return to it. And he brings it into total focus in chapter 3 and verse 12. He says this, he wants his people out of Egypt in order that they might worship him. It strikes me that perhaps the Israelites had forgotten that first and foremost, they were there to worship the God who created them and had chosen them. Perhaps the busyness and distractions of work and family and a little bit of slavery thrown in there had managed to put worship on the back burner. We then have this incredible discourse between Moses and God. And Moses comes up with every objection that he can think of as to why he shouldn't be doing this. But God is ready for him and meets every objection. Let me give you some examples. In chapter 3, in verse 11, Moses says, I am not worthy. In verse 12, God says, It's all right. Moses, I will go with you. It's not about your worthiness. Okay. Verse 13, Moses says, but I don't know enough about you, God. And in verse 14, God says, it's okay, Moses. I am is enough. Then into chapter 4, in verse 1, Moses says, my lived experience is that the people aren't going to listen to me. They didn't listen to me before. They're not going to listen to me again. In verses 2 to 9, God then says, it's okay, Moses. I will give you signs so that they will believe. Then in verse 10, Moses says, yeah, but God, you don't realize I am completely incompetent. And verse 12, God responds, it's okay, Moses. I will speak through you. Then the clincher. Verse 13, Moses says, okay, send someone else. And God then responds, verse 14 to 16, okay, I'll send Aaron, your brother, with you and speak through you both. I mean, if you were God, would you have gotten just a little bit frustrated here with Moses? Nevertheless, God has entered into this personal relationship with Moses and takes his views into account, varying his plans, it would seem, accordingly. And sometimes we argue with God about our calling, and yet God gently persuades us out of relationship with us to move with him with our warts and all. After all, I think God looks at it this way. You can't steer a stationary car. Finally, having accepted the mission, Moses goes back to Jethro and says in verse 18 of chapter 4, let me head back to Egypt and see if any of my folks are still alive. Wow. The tiny stone that will cause an avalanche has begun to move. How exciting.